Hi everyone. We're probably 5 minutes early, but I mean, I'm happy to start if you want me to. Probably saves just sitting around. Yeah, so thanks for coming. Awesome turnout. So obviously there's a few people interested in IP, and hopefully, you know, if you've got any questions or anything, hopefully I can cover some of them in this talk, but there's a lot to cover, and I made the rookie mistake of including about 70 slides in this presentation. So I'm going to get some RSI on my finger by the time I get to the end, but we'll see how we go. So just a bit about me to get started, I guess. I started with level design in Duke Nukem 3D. That was kind of my foray to the game development world. When I hit intermediate school, QBasic was all the rage. And so the cool thing about it is you could just go into the code and change anything you like, and 9 times out of the 10 just break everything and nothing would work. So that, you know, it's my informal programming experience. And then I've stumbled across RPG Maker, which was just amazing. The tools just enabled you to create these worlds and a narrative and everything else around that, which is awesome. A bit of a story about this one. I assume some of you remember this game. I'm not too old. So when I started high school, this game was all the rage. You press the space bar to fly up and down, and you get to dodge these walls. And so when I started high school, having a little bit of experience in QBasic, most of the computer science classes were kind of talking about, this is how you Google stuff or ask Jeeves. And I saw this cool icon on the desktop called Visual Basic, and I'm like, oh shit, it can be visual? Sort of go to 10. And so I made a clone of this game, and I called it the Duck Game, because on the right-hand side of the screen, there was a duck that moved up and down. It had 2 different frames, one with the duck's mouth open, in which case he was spewing projectiles at you, and one with the duck's mouth closed. And I guess the funny part of the story is, with my 12-year-old sense of humor, I made it so whenever you got hit by one of these projectiles, it would give you an insult. You aren't very good at this game, to put it politely. And so this game kind of took off. It's got my first claim to fame, that within kind of the computing settings, the computing classes, people would play this game behind the teacher's back. Just Alt-Tab when they come around. And then one day after class, I got asked to stay behind, and I'm like, shit, here we go. I thought I was going to, it's advancing, sorry. I thought I was going to get in trouble for the offensive language that I was using when you didn't do so well. And instead, my teacher was just like, holy hell, how did you make this? And I won't go into the details, but for the programmers in the room, I actually saw someone playing this game towards the end of my high school career. Like, it was still around. It was still kicking around on the school computers, except the computers had got like 5 times more powerful, and it was running about 20 times faster than what I designed it to. So rookie mistake, and I've learned the error of my ways, but some of you can probably relate to that. I left high school and I went into engineering. I'm actually an electronic engineer of all things, and if you see some of the access control readers on the doors as you enter in and out of the building, I was actually involved in the design of those. So it's kind of cool to have a little piece of history that I can kind of show my kids when I walk into a place and be like, I worked on that. And then more recently, I've always kind of toyed around with games. I've taught myself networked game development, but I've never had the courage, I guess, to try and release a game to the public. And so when the lockdown hit, I thought, why not? My wife went back to work full time. I dropped down to part-time hours, stayed at home with the kids, and in my spare time, I started making a game in Unity. But really, for me, where it all began is with this game here. Does anyone know what it is? Just a show of hands, you don't have to say anything. Okay. Does anyone know that game? Does anyone see any similarities between the games? Just a couple of subtle similarities. So the game on the left is called Golden Axe Warrior, and as a kid, I was like, oh man, this is awesome. We got a Sega Master System when I was like 4 or 5 years old, And this was kind of my first foray into RPGs, and I don't know if you want to call it open world, but these environments where you just did whatever you wanted, and if you went left and found the blue monsters first, you'd just die because they were too powerful. And looking back at it, I can see that it was a clear effort by Sega to monopolize on the goodwill that was in the Zelda brand, because the Zelda was super popular and everyone knew about it at the time. But yeah, IGN had some pretty not nice things to say about it, which hits me right in the nostalgia gland pretty hard. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about IP. As I say, 70 slides, so I'll try and keep this quick, but we need to first kind of talk about what IP is. That'll be fairly self-explanatory for most of you, but I'll touch on it anyway. We need to talk about the international release market, because it's really easy to come up here and say, in New Zealand, you can get these forms of protection, but, for most people in the room, if not everyone in the room, your bigger markets are going to be US, Europe, China, wherever, So I think the New Zealand market as a whole is comparatively small. We can talk a bit about that, but yeah, you just need to keep in mind that most games have a global market, and you're playing by international rules. And so keep that in mind if you're doing any research on, can I get a trademark, that kind of stuff. You really want to be focusing a little bit broader than New Zealand specific advice. Right, we'll talk a bit about branding and trademarks, goodwill, copyright and ownership, licensing and agreements, privacy and liability, patents, which is, given my electronic background, that's kind of my my day-to-day job. Yep. And if we've got time at the end, a couple of just kind of recent developments around NFTs and things like that. Right, setting the stage. So most of you probably know what IP is. It's really just what's protecting the intangible assets that your company holds. There are formal registered rights. You can get patents, registered designs, trademarks, and there's unregistered IP. So this is, copyright, goodwill, trade secrets, know-how, and yeah. So let's get that out of the way, nice and easy. When I put this presentation together, I really wanted to kind of provide some practical advice, some takeaways that you could go away and say, this would be a good idea. I should do that. But I really just want to preface this by saying everyone's situation's a bit different. If you're a one-man developer like I am, if I can even call myself that, the advice for me is going to be completely different to if you're a company that's just invested $250,000 in a new IP. I think the more you invest, the more it kind of makes sense to file for protection for what you're doing. Hashtag not legal advice. So quick breakdown of international markets. A lot of you are probably familiar with this, but you've got China and US right at the top of the table, 40 and 36 billion respectively. Japan and Korea, yep, they do pretty well. And then the rest of those countries listed are basically Europe. By way of comparison, Australia sits at about 850 million annually, I believe, and the New Zealand market is somewhere around 350 million. So, there's a lot of activity. It's a relatively big market, like I think for most companies, if they were releasing a physical product in New Zealand and said that the market was 350 million, they'd be stoked. But it's kind of, we can talk about this as well, but the market for software and games is very different, and discoverability issues and everything else, which is why you see these successes that once they get that traction and they go gangbusters, everybody knows about them. And then for every success, there is a large number of non-successes. Right, branding. So I think for most people in the room, this is probably one of the most kind of IP assets, which is kind of front and center of your business. If you've made a game, you've arguably looked at what you're going to call the game. And so I just want to make sure understand the disconnect, obviously, between the brand and the trademark itself. So the brand is kind of protected by a trademark, but it can cover anything, really. There's some examples here. We've got company brands like Bethesda. We've got game brands like Fallout. We've got series branding like the Elder Scrolls. We've got logos like Tales of Fox. you know, all of these things kind of factor into your brand identity. And, you know, I'd argue that even the people that work within your within your companies can form part of that brand identity, particularly if they're kind of the public-facing figure on the, you know, I think Chris Wilson for Grinding Gear Games, for example, I think is kind of almost synonymous with the product now. That Ben Brode for Hearthstone, for example, you know, there's kind of, it's hard to file a trademark application for a person, but nonetheless, they can form part of your company and your brand, your values and everything else. So trademarks are really the formal registered right that protects your brand. You may see in some places a brand be listed with like a little TM on the end. That is generally an indicator that it's an unregistered brand. So you can use a brand without registering it. That's not a problem at all. We see a little R in a circle. That's normally a registered right. Things get a little bit messy if you're releasing internationally, because if you release all of your imagery with a R in a circle globally across the world, you've got to kind of realize that your mark might not be registered everywhere that you're using it. And there are some rules against claiming that you have registered rights when you don't. So that's why even Coca-Cola, sometimes you'll see a little TM next to their brand rather than an R in a circle. Yeah. The examples around the outside, I mean, you're probably familiar with the issues that Meta is having around protecting Meta. I mean, they've got pretty deep pockets to throw at these problems to make them go away. But when it comes to the branding itself, you know, it always comes down to an assessment of how similar it is to other brands that are on the market, and typically for brands within for the same classes of goods, for example. We can talk a bit more about classes later, but for example, there's certain classes that are really applicable to software and game development that aren't so relevant for others, such as clothing manufacturers and the like. How do you choose a good trademark? So a lot of this advice is kind of, how do you choose a legally good trademark? And there's a definitely disconnect between a legally good trademark and a good trademark for discovery purposes and everything else. And I've got a few examples of both. But you really want to be as distinctive as possible without just describing what you do. So don't... There are so many examples of purely descriptive trademarks that have been roaring successes. Microsoft Flight Simulator is a classic example where it's like, okay, what's your game? Oh, it's a flight simulator. Okay. It's like, there are cases where you can actually get protection for a mark that's purely descriptive just because it becomes distinctive through use. You know, Microsoft have been selling flight simulator games for years, and because they've built up goodwill and reputation in it, when people see the flight simulator branding, they're like, ah, that's a Microsoft product, and therefore it's arguably registrable and is registered, but that's a tough road to walk. So if you're at the early stages, you haven't started marketing your game as Bob's Flight Simulator, I implore you to consider a less descriptive, a more distinctive mark. Right, some examples. These are all what I consider to be great examples, and I'll fire through them pretty quickly. None of them are particularly descriptive, and yet they're all very distinctive. Often there's kind of a callback, if you like, to the game itself. Diablo, ignoring the immortal stuff that's happening, is a great mark because, you know, it's a Latin, Spanish for the devil, and it's a game about fighting, you know, a demonic invasion. Terraria, similar kind of undertones. Borderlands, you know, you see what I'm getting at here is that you want to really create that connection in people's mind where you're like, oh, I was playing that game about where you're running through the Borderlands, and I immediately know that it's called Borderlands because I've made that connection in my mind. I'll give you some examples of ones where that connection has failed, for me at least. All right. You can only learn so much from the good examples. It's the not so great examples where I think you learn a lot more. So Gary's mod, The problem I have with this is that mod is just common parlance, and you can't really protect Gary's something, because Gary down the road might want to make a Gary's tower defense game, and it's arguably just not distinctive. Probably distinctive through use, but tower defense hero, I mean, I don't probably have to say too much more on that one. It's purely descriptive. Tower defense is a genre of game, and hero is just so commonplace that you shouldn't really be entitled to a monopoly on that term. So, zombie shooter. Football manager. Another one where I'm like, what? Is that the best you could come up with? But again, probably distinctive through use. Space Engineers, a game about being a space engineer. Although, what is a space engineer? I know when I studied at university, space engineering wasn't on the list. So it kind of is arguably this made-up term, although if you just consider the words in their normal meaning, it is kind of descriptive. Stumble guys. Judging from the laughter in the room, I think you know what this is a direct rip-off of. And this is one of the great points where like kind of the legal advice really kind of detaches from the commercial advice. When I prepared these slides back in July, Stumble Guys had made $24 million US. And for me to stand up here and say, they shouldn't have done that. I mean, who am I to say? Obviously, they're opening themselves up for legal challenge for various reasons. They've knocked off copyright, trademarks, everything you could imagine. But they had good business sense, I guess. They were released for a mobile platform where Fall Guys wasn't available on mobile, and that's just a huge untapped market. So, an interesting case. I actually apologize for this slide. I replaced this card in particular. I just didn't want it to be seen as offensive, but I'm in no way endorsing a game about Trump. And yeah, you can't use someone else's likeness without their permission. Not only can you not really trademark someone else's likeness, it opens you up to all sorts of defamation problems. If you look at the kind of blurb for that game, it's like, bro, it's just a parody. We're just joking around. It's like, yeah, that doesn't really fly. There are exemptions to copyright infringement by way of parody in the US, but again, you need to look broader than that, and those exemptions don't apply in other markets. And so, yeah. Uwebs too. Again, Ultimate Epic Battle Simulator. Ultimate Epic are kind of laudatory terms. You're just saying how good the product is rather than, coming up with your own name for it. Uwebs itself is probably fine from a trademarking perspective, but I like to contrast this one to Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, if you guys are familiar with that. I think the Totally Accurate in that is arguably laudatory, but it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's if anyone's played the game, you can understand that they're not trying to be totally accurate. So I think they've added some distinctive character to that mark as well. The other cool thing about the Totally Accurate Battle Simulator is that the acronym TABS is just so much easier to pronounce than UWebs. So when you're talking to your friends and be like, I found this great game, and they're like, what's it called? It's like Ultimate Great Amazing Battle Simulator. They're like, or UWebs. It's like, anyway, there's another example of that as well. And I've already talked about Flight Simulator, but I kind of have a personal grievance against simulator games in general. And often people, and apologies if you have a game that's released that's something simulator, I sincerely apologize, but there are a lot of games out there which are just what it is, simulator. Power Wash Simulator. PC Building Simulator. And it has another problem as well, outside of this kind of branding and recognition thing, is that if you search for simulator on Steam, you're competing with everyone else who had the same great idea to tack simulator on the end of their game. Sorry. And then we've got some edge cases, which I think are even more interesting again. Cookie clicker. Everyone knows that's probably quite descriptive, but at the same time, it's really distinctive. I don't think there would be an argument to be made that someone else would want to call their game cookie clicker. It's kind of descriptive, but at the same time, highly distinctive. And Yeah, I think that one's probably okay. And after bagging on simulator games, I put Goat Simulator on this slide because, again, what is simulating a goat experience? And kind of like Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, if you've played the game, you know it's nothing about really simulating being a goat, eating grass and doing what else goats do. It's about crazy physics and causing mayhem and all sorts. VVVVVVVV is a legally strong mark because no one else is going to want to use that. Discoverability-wise, I think it has some problems. Again, how do you talk to your mate about that game you're playing? Oh, when I was preparing these slides, I actually saw another game on the Steam market, which is VVVVV with 5 Vs. And if you look at the Steam reviews, they're all like, oh, I thought this was somehow associated with Terry's game. And yeah. I say no one else would want to use a random length of Vs, but apparently someone else did, and probably got more success doing that than they arguably should have. The other two examples here are actually really good trademarks, Outer Worlds and Outer Wilds. My problem with these ones is they kind of released around the same time, and for the longest time, when someone was talking to me about these games, they'd be like, oh, I've been playing Outer Worlds, and I'd be like, which one was that? And I have to pause and be like, ah, yes. So I guess my only point here is that you can have a really unique and distinctive mark, but if it releases at the same time as someone else with a really similar mark, then you can kind of shoot yourself in the foot. It's, you know, it really sucks if you've spent a lot of marketing money kind of on the brand up until the point of release, and you learn that someone's going to release within a similar time period, because rolling back that investment is not something that you want to do. Brands are everywhere. I don't think they should all be protected. Dota 2 is a classic example. I don't even know how many characters are up to now. It's over 200 and something. If I was to stand up here and recommend they file trademark applications for every one of those characters, I think that'd be a bit disingenuous. I think it's just important to know that you can protect characters, Sonic and Tails and Mario, the common ones. And I think from a practical perspective, the more you invest in each individual character, the more it makes sense to protect those characters. So if you spin out a card game based on Leshrac, for example, then maybe having invested another $100,000, $200,000 into that IP, it may be worth just kind of getting some more formal protection in place around that to stop others kind of trading on your goodwill. I talked a bit about classes before. Here are some classes that might be relevant to you guys. And I think I can't really stand up here and give you any kind of meaningful advice without at least talking about costs. And so protection is based on the number of classes that you're claiming protection for. Someone like Coca-Cola will file for beverages and clothing and marketing and every class you can imagine, because they just have so much spillover reputation to all of these different kind of industries. The costs through James and Wells are typically $650 per class plus $300 for an additional class. You can do it cheaper yourself, and it's kind of, the important thing is to know that the mechanism's there. It's relatively cost effective, and again, these are New Zealand, Australian costs, and the big picture here is that if you want to protect your brand globally, then the costs can get really out of hand really quickly. And so I guess the takeaway here is that there are mechanisms, and this applies to patents, designs, and trademarks, where you can file a New Zealand application relatively cheaply, like basically before you start using it for marketing or release of your game. And then post-release, if it goes gangbusters, if it just takes off, then you can actually file, they're referred to technically as convention applications. You can file applications that claim priority to your New Zealand filing, so that they were treated as if they were filed on the same day. And so that means that someone else in another market decides to copy that brand, you effectively have that filing date, which was predated when it was released to the world, that you can kind of fall back on. And so in most cases, I wouldn't encourage people to just go out and file overseas applications on day dot. But the option is there to file relatively cheap in New Zealand, release the game, see how it goes. If it takes off, come and have a talk to us about doing stuff overseas. If it doesn't take off, you can just let the application lapse, just ignore it. You don't even have to renew it or anything. It's completely up to you. But the same kind of applies if you're interested in registered designs or patents as well. So I promise practical advice, and apologies if it doesn't apply to you, but my key tips would be to kind of, irrespective of whether you're a one-man band or like a huge studio, I think the base position would be to assume that your game is going to be a success and not step on other people's toes just on the basis that, no one will ever see this, because who knows, it might be the next Stumble Guys. If you're a smaller, small to medium, larger company, and you've started to employ people, you're starting to invest a lot more money in these brands, you're starting to engage marketing agencies to start really pushing the brand externally, then it makes a lot more sense kind of to file for trademark protection. My game, for example, my total outlay so far has been like $200, and I don't think it really makes sense for me to file a trademark. So there are cases where it's just like, well, let's just suck it and see. Goodwill. Sorry, a quick drink, but a lot of this will be kind of, already known to you guys. You've been working in this industry a lot longer than I have, but once you have a brand, kind of the next logical step is to start building goodwill in that brand, so that when you eventually release, people are more inclined to buy it. You can also hype something that's not really there. No Man's Sky, Cyberpunk. There's also a hype that works kind of less well than you'd like it to. Remember the BlizzCon announcement of, do you not have phones? I included this slide because I find this really interesting. It's kind of, when your IP reaches the point where you can just copy, release a clone of an existing game, knowing that it's likely to be a success, I think your IP is in a pretty good state. I don't think the Crash Bandicoot team were like, oh, let's make a Temple Run game, and they probably didn't have a big, long discussion of, are we going to recoup our development costs on that one? It was probably a little bit of a no-brainer. Again, a couple of triggering things on the slide, and apologies, these intended to be replaced. But yeah, as easy as you can build goodwill, you can destroy goodwill. The recent kind of one that springs to mind is the Unity ironSource merger, where the media kind of reported on this malware situation which occurred many years ago. And so it's really hard to get rid of that bad reputation once you've got it. So, when it comes to public PR, if you like, around your brand, just be careful what you're saying. Just keep in mind that it's really hard to get back goodwill that's been lost. Copyright will apply to almost everyone probably in the room. It covers artistic works, it covers the music, the audio, the art, even the code that you write if you're a programmer. And it by default, it's kind of, it's owned by you, the creator. If you're employed by another company, then, and there's so many caveats on this, but if you're employed by another company and you're doing it within your job description, you've been asked to write some code that performs a specific function, and you do that, it's arguably going to be owned by your employer. And for the cases where it's not, there's often an employment agreement which formally assigns that copyright to the company. But things get really messy, and particularly kind of in the modern working from home environment, where suddenly you're not working on company equipment anymore. You might not be working on company time, and you might be working on things that are outside the scope of what you were asked to do. You might have been, doing some new artwork for the player character and thought, I know what, it'd be great to go with this character, some other companion character or some other, you can start very easily working outside the scope necessarily of what you are instructed and paid to do. And in some of those cases, that copyright that you generate isn't owned by the company. And so if you're, if you're creating content, you should probably be aware of that. And if you're an employer, you should probably be aware of that too. And so the kind of safe position, I guess, is to formally assign the copyright from the people who worked on your project to the company before release. It kind of gets rid of these messy areas where your artist comes back later and says, wow, this game did really well and made $10 million. I know you paid me $10,000, but I'm going to file a copyright strike claim against you guys and demanding more money effectively. So relationships can sour when money is involved. And so getting on top of that stuff to start with is a good idea. So there's a bit of a difference between trademark infringement and copyright infringement. And so one of the advantages of formally registering your IP is that determining whether or not an infringement takes place is done by comparing the two brands. They do all sorts of tests, like side-by-side comparisons, imperfect recollection tests, and all this legal stuff you don't really need to know about. But if someone's infringing on your registered rights, they don't have to know that it existed. The rights are there, you're infringing it, you need to stop. It's clean, it's easy, it's nice. When it comes to copyright infringement, if someone else independently decided to come up with Fall Guys without knowing about Fall Guys, then that is not copyright infringement. And so you need to kind of be able to show, when it comes to copyright infringement, that there's some kind of connection between your original work and the copied work. I think in the case of Stumble Guys, that's really obvious, and it should be obvious to everyone in the room, but there are a lot of kind of more subtle cases, and there's lots to talk about here, but what you need to be able to establish, I guess, is that there's a reasonable a causal connection, a reasonable connection between your product and their product, and therefore a reasonable argument that they've infringed your copyright. This leads me on to a fascinating point that's kind of unique to the games industry, where a lot of IP is released, and the first thing that the marketing team will do is they'll say, this is a spiritual successor to this other game, or it draws inspiration from another game. And just from a copyright infringement perspective, if you say that Cities Skylines draws heavily from SimCity 4, you're providing a lawyer with that causal connection. So just keep that in mind. Yeah. The same applies to kind of your internal design documents. If you're briefing your team on like, yeah, let's make this cool new game, that brief shouldn't be like I want to make a SimCity 4. The game should be, I want to make a city building game, and I want it to have these elements, and I don't want you to go and look at what SimCity 4 is doing. I want you to kind of go away and brainstorm your own ideas for what that's going to look like. And that really establishes that what you're doing as a company is you're not intentionally infringing someone else's copyright. You're coming up with these ideas on your own merits, and in the unlikely event that it does one day sit before a judge, those documents can be discoverable. So someone's going to actually read them, and if your document says, yeah, let's just copy SimCity 4 but put it on mobile, then yeah, that's not a good position to be in. The Looker, for what it's worth, is hilarious and a great parody of The Witness. Again, parody is a defense to infringement. Yeah, they're skating on thin ice. I think, as much as there's legal mechanisms in here that The Witness could potentially go after The Looker for copyright, brand infringement, there's always the question of whether or not you should. And this just comes back to that issue of goodwill. If you go around, laying the hammer down on people who are just kind of, it's not probably going to go that well for you. We've talked a little bit about copyrights. I won't dwell on this one in the interest of time. You guys familiar with the CD Projekt Red software leak that happened? So Again, code is protected by copyright. If you happen to stumble upon that code, don't just use it wholesale. Proving copyright in code's kind of interesting. There's kind of classic examples where like bugs from Fallout 3 made their way through and are still there in like Fallout 4 because they've kind of used the same code base and stuff. And so something like that can trip you up where perhaps your game experiences exactly the same bug as The Witcher 3 or Cyberpunk 2077 or whatever. And it can be a red flag. But what you can do is you can look at that code. There's nothing stopping you, and you can take learnings from it in terms of how they structure things, you know, and apply those learnings to your game. But again, have good design documentation. Don't have a good conversation about which part of this code can we copy. Discovery we've talked about. That's what happens when it goes before a judge. Practical advice. So just be mindful as to what you claim your inspirations are. Think carefully about what you say publicly. Have the good design documentation. If you're employing others, make sure the contracts are sound. Formally assign the copyright. And yeah, assume internal correspondence, particularly when it's around, I really like what this other game is doing, let's copy that. You know, assume that stuff could go before a judge one day, and just make sure that you're not just copying things wholesale. I said at the start, there's a lot in this presentation, and we're starting to get into probably some of the less interesting stuff. So I'll gloss over the stuff fairly quickly. IP clauses are a classic one. You want to always be in a position where you, as the creator or as the studio, own the IP in your game. Often there needs to be agreements in place where a publisher can use that IP. They can use your brand without infringing your rights. And because the publisher's often releasing your product into different markets overseas, what they'll often do is they'll file for protection in that market so that, you know, others can't use it in that market, which is fine until the relationship sours and you realize that, oh crap, my publisher owns the rights for my game in China, and I can't release my game in China without infringing their registered rights. And so just make sure that these agreements that you enter into have some kind of clawback of any IP that may be filed by publishers. Attribution, my game uses assets that others have created. Cinti Studios, asset packs, audio, music, code snippets from various places. Just whenever you are grabbing that stuff, just make sure you keep a bit of a register of what the licenses those things are provided under, what you're using it for. So when it comes to your credits, you can look for attribution. You can also look into things like whether or not you're using the assets within the scope of the license that it's provided for. The classic example might be like a level editor that you're including, where you can actually give people control over the assets that you're supposed to have exclusive control over. For example, they may be able to break them apart, take the ladder off the stairs, you know, make the stairs longer, you know, all that kind of really useful stuff, going back to Duke Nukem game design. But yeah, just be a little bit careful when you're using other people's assets that you're using them within the terms in which they've provided them to you. Privacy, I really just want to touch on the general data protection stuff. So New Zealand's Privacy Act was updated in 2020, and it's got more teeth, but it's still a bit of a gummy shark. The kind of the European system, GDPR, some of you will be familiar with it, has real teeth to it. And if your business model involves getting information from users, creating accounts, you know, personal identifiable information, you really need to make sure that you're complying with this stuff. The last bullet point there should be enough to scare most people. So the fines, 20 million euros or 4% of the annual global turnover. Not whichever is lower, whichever is higher. So for me, my 4% might be $4, but the 20 million is going to sink me. If you're Microsoft or Facebook or Google, the 20 million you'll laugh at, but 4%, you know, you're going to you're going to have problems convincing your investors that, yeah, that was a good idea. So, advice again. If you're going to have user information, just make sure that you have a proper privacy policy. A lot of these things require that you have a dedicated privacy officer and that you comply to requests for information that's held. Make sure that you're using it for fair and reasonable purposes. You know, you're not just harvesting everything from everybody because you want it. Third-party assets, keep a register, makes things easier towards the end. IP ownership, we've talked about. Patents. So this is kind of this is kind of my area of expertise, but I think for most people in the room, patents are probably fairly far down the list, which is why I've just bunged them in at the end of this presentation. What I just want you to be aware of is that you can get patents for software. There's some pretty memorable cases I'll touch on briefly. Yeah, it's kind of, it's hard to give advice on patents because a lot of it really depends on what you plan to do as a company. You know, patents can be used to kind of show people that you're experts in whatever your technology field is, whether it's AR or VR, irrespective of whether you're ever planning on using those, you know, those patents against other companies. You know, it can be handy for investment. There are so many different reasons why you might want a patent outside of just, you know, throwing it against people. The other point is as well is that you often hear that patents are kind of easy to work around. You know, you just change one little feature and you're no longer infringe. You know, patents aren't designed to protect the for loop, the if loop, the while true loop, because there's 100 different ways of implementing these things. They're about protecting the overall concept. And so it's part of the reason why software patents in particular are worded so abstractly. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a bit of a process. If you're considering things like your freedom to operate, your risk of infringing other people's patents. This one here, for example, I believe is for WarioWare. You can probably infer some information from it, but it's, yeah, it's a mess. I still got a little bit of time, I think. This one's near and dear to my heart as a electronic engineer. The device pictured is referred to as a hang printer. The basic concept is that, you know, normal 3D printers are these little flatbed box things that build up a certain thing of a certain size. And so there's an outfit who thought, hey, why don't we just mount some cables in the corner of the room, write some code that lets it move the printer around in 3D space, and we can print boats and all sorts. We can just go ham with it. And so they thought, we're going to make this open source. Anyone can use it. They can download the source files. They can download the CAD files for the parts. And then some naughty person decided they'd take all that information and file a patent application. There are problems with the patent system, and speaking as a patent attorney, these problems suck. Particularly in the US, if you're aware of a patent prior to examination, you can basically contact the examiner. You file what's known as third-party observations that say, hey, this thing should really not be granted because it's actually just all been taken from this public domain resource. But once examination is started, that door closes. And that's what happened in this case. They weren't aware of the patent until it went through examination. And now, to get documents in front of the examiner, you have to go through a formal legal process. And they raised a GoFundMe campaign to get the $60,000 required, which is just ridiculous, right? Frustrating and ridiculous. So the point I want to make here is that often people want to give technology back to the industry, to the community, and there are ways to do that. And sometimes best intentions can cause problems. In this particular case, the funny thing is that if they had filed a patent application for the technology, that probably would have been found by the US searcher, because US searchers are really good at finding patents. You know, it's their bread and butter, but they're not great at searching, you know, Google, to be fair, or just kind of forums and that kind of thing. They just don't have the time and the resources to do it. EA's got their accessibility pledge package where they have patents on there, such as the ping system used in Apex Legends, that are just, that they say you're free to use this stuff. And so there's kind of a resource out there that you can make these things available. You're still showing to the industry that you have the technical expertise to create these great systems. And so if your business model is being acquired by another one of these companies, then patents, again, have their uses. I will quickly fly through these slides. Just a quick note about the end of the graphs. There wasn't a general consensus to stop filing patents, but what happens is they're normally published 18 months after filing, and so we don't have all of the published 2022 patents yet. It's not an actual drop-off. I probably should have just cropped it from the graphs, but here we are. Countries for filing really aligns with the markets as well. This is for just general gaming software, if you like. I've got a couple of slides on AR and VR. The companies are the companies you'd expect. VR, like I said, slightly different focus in terms of key filing countries, players that you'd probably all expect. AR, again. And so I guess the takeaway here is that if you're working in one of these cutting edge spaces where there are lots of applications being filed all the time, what you can do is you can set up these really targeted watches on very specific things like what you're working on. If your bread and butter is haptic gloves for VR applications, you can set up a targeted watch that says, hey, someone's just filed an application for this. And if that is going to be a problem for you, then you can do these things we can talk about. We can send a letter to the US examiner and be like, hey, they shouldn't have this because it's known, you know. And similarly, you know, if someone else has actually just solved the problem that you're working on, perhaps continuing to spend hundreds and thousands of R&D on solving that problem is perhaps not as fruitful as it could be. Delaying patent costs, flying through this. Like the trademark thing, you can file in New Zealand really cheap and easy. It doesn't even have to be like a formal document prepared by a patent attorney, although there are benefits to doing so sometimes. You can basically file an application for like $250 and release the product, release the game, whatever it is, and then reassess the commercial importance of that based on how well it does in the market. Instead of a 6-month window, there's a 12-month window when it comes to patents. And there are also mechanisms to push out the international filing costs out to about 30 months from filing. So yeah, that's normally where the big costs come in. Some famous patents. So this is Crazy Taxi's navigation system. They enforced this one against Simpsons Hit and Run, which is why there's kind of an awkward finger thing in Simpsons Hit and Run. Can anyone even see what this is? This is the problem with software patent drawings, by the way, is they kind of have to be black and white. There's no kind of middle ground. Anyway, this is a Nemesis system from the Shadow of Mordor games. Loading screen gaming, which is, you know, with loading times the way they are at the moment, it's kind of redundant, but there's a reason probably why there weren't many loading screen games historically. I'll just pull these up. You can probably read them. I'm really at the end of my rope in terms of time here. And finally, obviously, there's just all of the commercial things around, okay, so you've got all of these different ways that you can protect your IP, but really, should you? And how do you? Cease and desist letters, most of you will be familiar with. It's kind of, we have these rights, you're infringing them for these reasons, please stop, and or give us some money, here's a licensing agreement, something like that. DMCA, you're probably familiar with from YouTube's interesting implementation of it. But yeah, there are other legal mechanisms here to stop people doing things that are annoying you. Right, sorry, that was real compressed, but any questions?
Yeah, I've got one.
Yeah.
So, trademarking, like, obviously, say you're a small company in New Zealand, you trademark in New Zealand, you decide to take a big leap and trademark in the States, and then someone infringes on that, you send them a cease and desist, then they ignore it. I mean, I guess my question is, it's all been fine getting a trademark, but if the cost of enforcing it through US attorneys is kind of like $10,000 to $20,000 straight off the get-go, like how easy is it to actually legally enforce that infringement from New Zealand if it's happening in the States? But you are covered in the States.
Yeah, difficult. Absolutely. You know, this is really the point I want to hammer home. You know, these mechanisms exist, but they're not for everybody. And you know, just on enforcement in the US in particular, you know, a lot of US attorneys will work on contingency, meaning that they'll take your case if they think you've got a good chance of winning, and they'll basically take the majority of the damages from that case as payment. And if they don't win, it doesn't cost you anything. So there are options in these countries to enforce your rights. And I think as a business holder, often what you want to do is you just want to get them out of the market so that your game, your product, whatever it is the thing front and center in people's minds. People aren't looking at, oh, I could get Fall Guys, but there's also Stumble Guys, which looks exactly the same. Why don't I just get that? And so, yes, difficult to try and enforce from New Zealand. If you've only made $1,000 on the game, for example, don't even go there. But you know, if there is real benefit in trying to enforce that in these major markets, then yeah, often the decision is kind of made for you. No worries. Whenever I say contingency, I'm reminded of that Lionel Hutz business card. It's like, works on contingency, no money down. It's like, oh, I forgot the punctuation. Anyway.
I just wanted to share an anecdote where I just published a really little niche game, thought, no one care about that. Found this outfit with a really large application in a really large market, and I quickly registered my trademark that like then sent them it's not EDM, and just that was enough to scare them off.
Yep.
So just doing that, like the most basic, putting the C copyright to go, registering your trademark. It's good at nothing, right?
Yeah, and often those cease and desist letters come from lawyers, and you know, like if I received one for my game and they're like, stop, I'll be like, yes, sir. You know, like, oh, I'm done, you know. So yeah, often that cease and desist letter is a really cost-effective mechanism. You just really need to be able to point to a few things to say that, hey, this is what you're infringing. And the more rights you have, the more things you can point at to say, you know, you're infringing this, this, and this. So, hey, that's probably all we have time for. I just wanted to kind of put this offer out there. I think, honestly, that there's probably more that I can learn from you guys in this room than you can learn from me. And I think often you kind of find yourself in a position where you're like, what should I do from an IP perspective? Perhaps I'm a small studio or I'm a one-man band. I don't know the answer, and I don't want to engage the services of a lawyer or a patent attorney, whatever you want to say, because it's going to be prohibitively expensive. So I'll happily make the trade where come and talk to me. Tell me about what you're working on. Tell me about the problems that you're having, and I'll probably learn as much from that exchange, and I'm happily to give you some IP advice around that stuff. I've got a stack of business cards here in case nothing comes to mind today, but in 12 months' time, you're like, yeah, okay, there's kind of an IP issue here. Is there someone I can talk to? You know, pick up the phone, give me a call, we'll have that conversation. If I need to charge you because it's going to take me a week to give you an answer, then I'll let you know in advance. But most of the stuff, most of the kind of general pointers is often what's required. Yeah, so thank you.